All right, hi everybody. This is Kevin Ring, president of FAMM, back with another edition of our Heart to Heart series. And I am so fired up to have Brittany Barnett with us. She's the author of a new book, which I'm going to plug right here, called The Knock at Midnight. It's gotten a lot of buzz on Amazon, and I am a readaholic. I read a lot of books, and I do a lot of criminal justice work, and I get tired of reading criminal justice books. But this one is so phenomenal. I can't recommend it highly enough because it is not a sentencing textbook or a criminal procedure book. It is a book that is very much something that FAMM would write if the organization could write a book collectively, which is the personal stories of people who are going through an insane justice system and the injustices it produces. And Brittany is a remarkable advocate. It's a memoir, so it tells her story and how she got involved in these issues, which I want to talk with her about today. But I want to start with sort of just a mini review and just basically say sort of my takeaway from this was this book is a gift. It is a gift to, I think, Black girls everywhere who have any doubt about what they can achieve, any doubts they have about any lack of confidence about what they can become, even in this society. There's been great advances. But if they have any doubts that they can achieve at the highest level, whether that's corporate law or finance or social justice, three areas where Brittany has performed, read this book. It's a gift to women of any race or ethnicity who have been stuck in abusive relationships and think that maybe there's something wrong with them and that they did something wrong and that they are weak somehow, because Brittany is a powerhouse and she talks about her experience and how she got out of that relationship and achieved the great things she did. It's a gift to the love of families, all of you who are fighting for incarcerated loved ones, to see what she went through with her family and then her extended family, her clients, and her advocacy on their behalf. And then finally, I think it's a gift to the criminal justice reform movement, of which FAMM is a part, because it is not a dry textbook, and it is not something that you have to have a law degree to read. It is about meeting people who face injustice because of a cruel system that treats, people not as individuals, but as lesser than or other than. And just hearing their stories, and as Brittany weaves that into her own life and her work, you realize that there are things that we can correct in the system. And her story speaks for itself when you read just what she has achieved. But it should give hope to anybody who's doing this work as advocates, that the work is noble, it's needed, and that we have a lot to do. So one, thanks, Brittany, for joining us. And because it is a memoir, I don't want to give everything away, but it's like, we should just start with your story, because that's how this book starts with is, you didn't grow up thinking about becoming a criminal justice advocate. So what about your upbringing and how did you get to the spot where you are?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I wrote this book for a few reasons, and you touched on a lot of them. And so to know that that's coming across gives me great joy. I grew up Black daughter of the rural South, grew up in East Texas, a town called Bogota, like 1,200 people. And, I had a pretty happy childhood for the most part. I talk about being on my piece of doors unlocked, windows wide open, piece of rural Texas, and just living the life of a child, But even with that happiness, my mom suffered from drug addiction. And so as a child, I witnessed, firsthand how addiction devastates families and the stronghold of it, and just how nuanced and complex it is. But on top of that, what adds to that complexity is growing up as an 80s baby in the mid 90s at the height of the war on drugs, when you're taught through school the DARE programs and the Just Say No programs, and on the one hand you have this programming at school where it's kind of like those who fall prey to addiction are like the most morally corrupt of us all. You know, only the weak become addicted to drugs. And on the other hand, my mom was addicted to drugs. And so being a young and an adolescent going into my teen years, trying to rectify that all and trying to be in a position as a child where disasters unfolding an arm's length away, but really not understanding the disease of addiction. And so definitely I cannot say that even with that, I had a horrible childhood. And I use this Nikki Giovanni quote in my book, and I love her. And it's from her poem, Nikki Rosa. And it basically says, you know, they'll probably look back at my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. And she begins that quote with Black love is Black wealth. And so, you know, there were challenging times, you know, for sure, but it brought me firsthand to a lot of these issues, Kevin, that we face in trying to transform the system.
Yeah, well, it's funny reading this because I mean, you're a Black woman growing up in Texas, and it may not be clear, I'm a white male, and I grew up in Connecticut. And yet what you describe as your childhood is mine. Open doors, you know, neighborhood, running from house to house, total freedom. And then the same thing, I grew up in a house with an alcoholic father and a mother who suffered from mental illness. By all accounts, I was happy though. I didn't know what normal was, so that was fine. So much of the work that I do now, you know, because of my own experience getting involved with the justice system, people say, well, why didn't you? Because I was one of those people who would have seen in the past drugs or moral failing or people are bad who do that sort of stuff. But it's because I was ignorant of it. I didn't grow up with it. One thing that was painfully clear in your book is you had drugs all around you. It wasn't just your mother's addiction, friends, boyfriends, family. I mean, drug use and selling was all around you. I mean, is that right? Fair to say?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair to say. I grew up at a time where some involvement in drugs seemed like the norm. It was the norm. You either knew someone using drugs or you knew someone selling them. And in high school, I even dated a drug dealer. And looking back on it as a 36-year-old, now it was everywhere, you know, and not saying it was right or wrong or indifferent, but it was part of the culture. That's just how it was.
Yeah, I just think that gives somebody a totally different impression or a different view of that, right? So like, I didn't grow up with that, you know, and so the idea that good people could do that, because these are otherwise people that you look up to and you're friendly with, you know, the character's fine. It's just, and would you say, I know with your mother it was addiction, would you say that most of the drug use you saw was driven by addiction? Is it greed? Is it economic, you know, sustainability or sustenance because lack of jobs or opportunity? What do you think it was? All of those things? What was driving the drug use?
You know, the underlying issue I feel for in general, not specifically related to my family, in general, is just a suffocating poverty, suffocating socioeconomic conditions. I talk about in the book where I grew up and when I was in high school and dating the guy who sold drugs, but I also talk about just the racial discrimination in that town that stemmed from decades before and how jobs were leaving and there were just no resources and access to capital. You know, I saw that firsthand. You know, I saw, because I had friends who sold drugs to survive. I knew they sold drugs to eat.
Yeah.
And it's the difference in being there, seeing it and knowing that versus not experiencing that at all. And I can see how it's hard to really visualize and understand if you're not there. And, you know, luckily for me, I had just a very loving, extended family. My mom was very present even still, you know, and so things were a little different, but it doesn't make it any easier and it doesn't make my perspective any different, you know, and I saw it. I saw bad things happening to good people.
Well, you talk in the book, I mean, you know, there's a theory out there that all of us break the law and only some of us get caught, you know, that you know, Harvey Silverglate has the book called 3 Felonies a Day that basically says an average American, you know, does commit 3 felonies a day, whether it's taxes or, you name it, obstruction of justice in some way you wouldn't know, or wire fraud for doing something you can't even imagine. You basically cop to the fact that, you could have been charged with helping your boyfriend sell drugs. I mean, and I don't say that in an accusatory way that like you were thinking criminally, but like it was more even in the book you talk about in hindsight that, geez, under the wrong circumstances, I could have been caught up in this.
Most definitely. When I look at the work that I do and what I've learned about federal drug conspiracy laws and just the wide net cast with this very vague law, absolutely. And I look at my ignorance and me being so naive and thinking, well, I'm not selling drugs. I don't know anything about what he's doing, but that didn't negate the fact that I was driving my car to Dallas to take him to get drugs. And when I learned more about the drug conspiracy laws and just what it really meant and how I wouldn't have had to have known anything that was happening.
Yeah, do you think this is something, I mean, you've probably heard this discussion that in a lot of white rural communities with opioids, that they're experiencing now what maybe more Black communities were experiencing earlier. You're seeing a lot of deaths of despair, overdoses. This is clearly driven by lack of opportunity, depression, other things. And now we're just seeing that more. I mean, do you just think it hit the Black community sooner? What's similar? What's different about those experiences? Because it's definitely hitting more communities than it was in.
Yeah, I feel there's a lot of similarities, more so than we think. I think the differences are demographics, geographics, and I feel even now with what we're seeing with opioids, it is devastating. It's an epidemic. It's costing people their lives. It is a crisis in which we're treating as a public health crisis, and it very much is. But when the crack epidemic hit in the late 80s, it wasn't treated as a public health crisis, but it should have been. Instead, it was demonized and criminalized. Yeah. And because of that, you have two very similar situations being treated very differently. And, Kevin, I just think it's beyond the point of legitimate debate anymore as to why.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you think, part of it is race. A big part of that is race. I think a big part of it is just the country's understanding of drug abuse. We're just smarter about, this idea of it being a moral failing versus it being a public health issue. And I'm just trying to think, do you think it has anything to do, which do you think is the driver of those things? Do you think, because the crime rate was a lot higher in the 80s and 90s too, right? And so there was this, public safety and crime were always ranked number 1 and 2 in the polls as what people were worried about. Whereas now we have these opioid deaths and crime isn't listed as a top concern. And so it's almost easier to tease out that this is not related to safety. This is public health. And at the time they got conflated, right? You had the murder rate was, 5 times higher in 1980 than it is today. And so I think people were conflating drug use and that high crime rate. How do you tease out that? Race overlays it all, I get.
No, I think it's the conflation issue, as you mentioned, and I also feel, as far as the crime rate is concerned, murders aside, that Black communities are more heavily policed. So they're gonna have a higher crime rate, and so I think we have to keep that and take that in consideration too. And I feel it's more in the forefront of people's minds with opioid, and it's developing the sense of empathy and compassion because that's how it's being presented to the media. Crack was all over the media. It was national news. It was presented in Times and Newsweek thousands of times. I've done research in college about this. It all was presented to the media. It was just presented in a different way. And so, however we're consuming that as consumers of the media, that goes to our hearts and minds too. And I think, there were times that as it relates to the crack in the 100-to-1 ratio, which I'm sure many of the viewers are very familiar with, even over time, when we learned that a lot of the justification was unfounded. When the Sentencing Commission produced multiple reports showing how this 100-to-1 ratio was unjust and how some of the science and resources that were relied upon were incorrect, it still didn't change anything.
Yeah, and to me that was the sin. That
we had this heightened sense of awareness. So let's plead, ignorance and innocence in the late 80s. But what about in the early 90s when the Sentencing Commission was like, we got this wrong over and over again, and it took till 2010, for the Fair Sentencing Act for it to begin to change. So there's a lot of underlying factors there, and the main thing to me is people are still suffering, and we can't get caught up in the nuances and overlook the fact that while we're trying to figure it out of what the drivers are, there are people, Black, brown, white, all different races that are in prison. I see them all the time with the work I do with the Buried Alive Project that have been in prison since the 80s, since the early 90s, even though this public perception has changed, even though laws are changing, people are still serving time today under yesterday's drug laws.
Yeah, well, let's get you to Buried Alive Project by talking about your early career. So this is happening at home, but you're going to go be a lawyer, and you're going to be a corporate lawyer, and you're going to be, something totally different. What were you thinking, and what was your dream?
Oh yeah, my dream was to be a lawyer, always, and for some reason, once I got older into high school, becoming a lawyer just seemed like it was out of my league. It felt like something I couldn't obtain. And looking back, I know that it's because I didn't know any lawyers. There was no representation in my community, especially lawyers who look like me. And I talk about in the book, the closest person who was a lawyer that looked like me was Claire Huxtable on the Cosby Show.
Yeah.
Her power suits, her briefcase, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a corporate lawyer. I wanted to go into the business sector, and that was my dream. And unfortunately, oftentimes, our environments and circumstances kind of limit those dreams, or we allow it to limit those dreams. And I couldn't see myself becoming a lawyer because I couldn't see any lawyers. And honestly, Kevin, I read a book. We talk about how much you read and just the importance of books, but I read a book in high school. It was a B.B. Moore Campbell book, and the protagonist in the book was a Black woman who worked at a bank. And me reading that book, I said, oh, I want to go work at a bank. I want to do that. And so I ended up going to college and became an accountant.
Yeah, it's so funny how much popular culture drives us. Like, you wanted to be Claire Huxtable and I wanted to be Alex P. Keaton. You had a more noble role model there. But so you do it and you like it enough. I mean, you're successful and you like it, but talk about, you start getting tugged, because how did you start getting the social justice bug or the criminal justice bug?
Yeah, so after becoming an accountant, I still had that dream of becoming a lawyer in my peripheral, and one of my mentors, I went to talk to him about becoming a lawyer, and he was like, oh, you should do it. I'm starting law school in the fall. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, if Ken can go to law school, I know I can go to law school, so it was that representation. And so I went to law school, knew I was going to use my accounting degree and try to climb the corporate ladder in corporate law, and got to law school at SMU in Dallas and took a critical race theory course where I came across the case of Sharonda Jones, and that was just a case that changed my life forever.
Yeah. I don't know if people know that, but maybe we'll talk about it in a bit. But you did have this tension about, it was a leap to go from, I mean, it's an evolution in the book, because you start working on this stuff in your free time, and then you decide to make the jump. Was there a feeling of, well, let me ask you this, was part of being a lawyer, you're buying a new car and stuff, was there a sense of like, I want to do well? Like, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Financially, we're like, it's important to me to be successful financially. And was that the trade-off you felt like you had to make between like financial success and where your heart was, or, what was that?
Yeah, it was financial success was definitely a part of it. Just the security that I had a very lucrative corporate career,
Yeah.
because of the accounting background. I was able to climb the ladder pretty fast as a corporate lawyer. And I honestly, Kevin, enjoyed my work
Yeah.
as a corporate lawyer. I loved it. And it came to the point where the balance was beginning to be too much for me. So it was the financial security, it was blazing the trail for young Black girls and girls of color to see themselves in me at these corporate tables and in these boardrooms. And it was another mixture of me just enjoying the work that I did.
Yeah.
It was not an easy decision. We talk about it. I talk about it a lot of just me taking the leap, but I think it's important for people to know that that was months of internal reflection and really making the decision, because I still like to have nice things. I don't believe in the struggle story at all still, but it's a lot harder now,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
wasn't easy. It wasn't easy.
Well, and in the book, I mean, you're not the case of the person who wanted to become a lawyer, then realized they were in the law library doing research all day and were miserable. You like the work. That's clear.
I did.
Yeah.
I really did.
Well, I'm a terrible interviewer because I'm gonna jump around, but I wanted to get like that part of your story in. You were successful doing that, and you chose this, but your first again experience with this was your mother's.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's just talk about what ended up happening with her, what her addiction led to.
Yes, my mom struggled with addiction most of my life. The earliest memory for me was probably 10 years old. And so that brings me to the age of 22, where my mom's addiction led her to prison. So my mom was sentenced to prison, the underlying issue totally related to her drug addiction. And going back to rural East Texas, there were no diversion courts. There were no programs recommended for my mom to get in. And my mom is here with this severe drug addiction, and she's sentenced to prison instead of being able to get the help that she needed. And so I found myself face to face with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about that. You go to visit her the first time, and it reads like every person I've ever talked to at FAMM about going to visit a loved one. You're nervous, you're worried about your bra, you're worried about setting off the alarm and all of that, and just, are you going to be able to hug this person and all that? I mean, just talk about that experience a little bit.
I will never forget the first visit with my mom. I could not wait to see her, to hug my mom, to smell my mom, to kiss my mom. All the while she was in county jail, there was no contact visits. It was just visits through the glass. And so I drive the 2.5 hours from Dallas to see her, and I go through all the things you just mentioned, the nervousness, the metal detectors, the barking guards, the metal, the clanging, the keys. And I just can't wait to get in this visit room to see my mom. And I get in the visitation room when I see the women in their white Texas issued prison uniforms and hugging their families and talking across from the tables, and I don't see my mama. And so I go ask the guard, hey, I'm here for Evelyn Fulbright. And I'll never forget her saying inmate number.
Yeah.
And I knew her prisoner number because I had memorized it. But just to know that my mom had just been reduced to a number was devastating in that moment, and adding to the dehumanization of the whole process. And I learned that because my mom hadn't been in prison for 60 days, we did not get a contact visit.
Yeah.
So I drove all that way with my hopes up for this visit, and we ended up visiting through the glass. And as most of the FAMM members already know, that glass is so deceptive. So deceptive. You're so close to your loved one, but you might as well be on another planet, And I just remember talking to my mom through the phone and just pressing that phone so hard up against my face because I just didn't want to miss a sound of her voice.
Did you feel shame? Were you ashamed of your mother? Were you embarrassed by the situation when you were growing up? And
very, I felt a lot of shame, even as a 22-year-old, because here I am. I graduated high school a year early. So I was 17 when I went to college. I had a bachelor's at 21, a master's at 22, and I'm working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the biggest accounting firms in the world. But my mom is in prison, you know, and there's no amount of education that could prepare you for that. And knowing that and being surrounded at Pricewaterhouse with my colleagues, and, you know, their parents are lawyers and doctors and accountants. I mean, they're still getting their cell phone bills paid, and we're 22 years old, you know? And so, yeah, there was a lot of shame. There was a lot of shame.
Yeah, you wrote something in the book I underlined. I remember you said nobody is suited for the experience of having a family member locked away in prison. And I think that's true. There's no type for that. You know, my kids coming to visit me, there's no experience that prepares you for that. Even if you're in a community, I assume that's over policed. The idea that like having someone locked away, having someone memorize your prison number is a totally, you know, foreign experience.
It is. And for me, with all the educational accomplishments I had and just always being Brittany in control of her life and prepared Brittany, and this is just something you can never prepare for, and just the mental trauma of it on the family members, and not to mention our loved ones in prison. It's a lot. It's a lot.
I want to talk a little bit about, now you're starting to experience prison with your mother's experience, but throughout the book, you're talking about different clients like Sharonda and.
You're muted.
I mute myself. I want to talk about, so now you're experiencing sort of the, I don't know, like the inhumanity of the system and the degradation and everything that goes into that. And your mother's experience, and I think this will resonate with anybody who has somebody in prison, you know, learning her prison number as opposed to her name. But then also, you're in a Texas prison that has no air conditioning. Mm-hmm. And then later when you're visiting Sharonda and others at Carswell, which everyone today is still just an absolute disaster. It's a women's medical facility, but the treatment is horrible. And then later you go see a client, another one that you freed, Corey Jacobs, and he talked about wanting to see a tree because he had been locked up. They hadn't been able to get outside. And I just want to talk about that, this idea that no matter what you did, society needs to think hard about, is this the way we want to punish people? I mean, is this treatment? I mean, you know what the others say, which is you do the crime, do the time, and whatever that entails, anything that follows from that is your fault because you put yourself in that position. But what's a better way to think about that? What would you say to people who say, well, you put yourself there?
Put yourself there.
Well, no, I'm saying that you've got yourself in trouble. So whatever happens to you while you're there.
My response to them would be put yourself there.
Oh, I got you. Yeah.
Let me, you know, and explain in a way where it's humanizing. And what I wanted to do with the book is I wanted to tell the truth about a couple of things. I wanted to tell the truth about racial inequities that bleed through the system. But most importantly, I wanted to tell the truth about the human beings that America keeps locked in cages. And they're much more, as Brian Stevenson says, and the worst thing they've ever done, you know, and we have to look beyond that and see their heartbeats. And once we do that, and people hear more of these stories, as FAMM does with their storytelling, as I write about in the book, you know, I think it will start to shift the paradigm and change hearts and minds, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was just hearing about the prison in South Carolina where they've boarded up the windows so these guys just never see natural daylight. And you know, even if you're serving a life sentence, that's cruel and unusual. But if you're not going to, I just don't understand why we disorient people so much to make the life inside so different than outside, right? I mean, when I was inside, one thing I thought was we're infantilizing these people in some ways. You know, you give them 3 meals, you know, you do your laundry, you just have this schedule, but you're not paying bills, you're not doing anything that's real life. And so you get institutionalized. That's one thing. But then the other thing is the treatment of treating them as lesser than, calling them inmate, calling them by their number, and what that does to your spirit. So that when you come out, I mean, what kind of confidence do you have to reenter society and to contribute?
Absolutely, it's completely counterproductive. The entire process, you know, it's counterintuitive. None of it makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that I learned through this process, and it's another reason I wrote the book, is to educate people about what I had learned. And criminal justice is a hot topic, it's popular, it's fashionable. But what I've learned through that is, and been as surprised at, is the more popular it is, the more fashionable it is, I've noticed just people still have no idea about how the system works. Mm-hmm. And so that part contributes to, you did the crime, you got to do the time, or not even thinking about the fact that what would it hurt for there to be trees on the prison yard?
Right.
What part of the punishment is that? And what I learned with my mom and just other work that I've done is people have to realize too, the punishment is having your freedom taken. The punishment is being in prison in the first place. And so having all of this extra dehumanization and just demoralizing obstacles in the way, it's really sick.
Yeah, and let's talk about your work. So you start getting into this, and then at some point in this process, you leave the law firm, you start Buried Alive Project. And talk about you are focused on a certain portion of the population. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, just to talk about how you decided what group you wanted to help and what that is and what that entails.
Yeah, so for me, and I'm sure a lot of people, transforming this criminal justice system is overwhelming. Just the thought of everything that needs to change is overwhelming. And when I left corporate law, I had a mission, and that was to get as many people free as I could under Obama. I didn't think past that. And so once President Obama left, and I stopped and realized I left my job. I really left my job. Like, what do I do next? And getting through the process, I was able to get clemency from President Obama for Corey Jacobs and Sharonda Jones, and hearing them and their survivor's remorse, and knowing that they left behind so many people who were just as deserving of freedom as they were, and understanding through their cases just the type of special grace and dignity it takes to carry a life sentence. There is no parole in the federal system. And that sentence to me it was just crushing through my personal experience with my clients. And so looking at how overwhelming the system was, trying to find out how can I be effective, I realized I can't be effective jumping from one hot topic in the system to the next. I was effective in this lane, and I'm going to stay in this lane. And so walking through a valley of a shadow of death, as we say, with my clients who had life, I knew that I couldn't leave the people who had life. And I wanted to focus on that group so I could be effective.
And these are people serving life sentences purely because of drugs, right?
Purely because of drugs.
And it was either 3 strikes or 841 or 851 enhancements. And let's talk a little bit about this and bring in your focus on racial equity, and how that plays in, because it certainly seems to me that one way race affects sentences is through repeated contact with the system, so that when you finally get that third sentence, it's enhanced because you've had these prior convictions that could have been old. Is that, that's one way, I think. How do you see race contributing to these longer sentences and the people you're dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see the life sentences coming from a lot of different ways. More than 50% are people who had prior convictions, and a lot of them didn't, like Sharonda, like Corey, like my client, Alice Johnson. They never touched the criminal justice system before. They got a life sentence based on just a slew of sentencing enhancements that were thrown at them. But when I look to the about 50% serving life for drugs that had the priors, I think of the case of Chris Young, who you all feature on your website as well. And I look at Chris Young giving a mandatory life sentence for his third strike, the 3 strikes and you're out. And I look at his 2 priors. And I go even further back than that, and I look at Chris's upbringing and just the severe poverty and trauma that he had to endure growing up. And I realized that Chris was handcuffed by his socioeconomic conditions long before steel handcuffs wrapped around his wrist. And his first prior, he was 18, and it was for about 6 grams of crack. His second prior, he was 19, and it was for less than 0.5 grams of crack, crumbs. So Chris's 2 priors, quantity-wise, weighed less than 3 pennies. And there is no doubt, and statistics even back this up, that communities like the communities Chris grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, are over-policed. So yeah, he was getting pulled over at these traffic stops. He wasn't getting stopped selling crack on the corner or a drug raid in a house. Crack was found as a result of traffic stops in his neighborhood. And so definitely race played a portion in that. And unfortunately, because of those 2 priors, he was eligible for an 851 enhancement, a mandatory life sentence, even though he never gone to prison for the priors. They were very low quantity, even though his federal role was low level. The Judge Kevin Sharp, had absolutely no choice but to sentence Chris to life. And it really shows with his case, it epitomizes so much that's wrong with society as a whole, but especially when we get to the criminal justice system. Chris's case really epitomizes the fact that more Black people and people of color are coming into the federal system with priors. And a lot of it, to me, should be and can be attributed to the fact that these communities are more policed. It's not that they're committing more crimes.
Do you see that? By the way, I just want to mention thank you to Beverly and Sandy and Lorraine. We see your comments and thank you for those. Do you see race playing a role at sort of the prosecution stage, the judging stage, or is it mostly, at that initial contact stage?
I think it is twofold. It's at the initial contact stage with law enforcement, and then once the person goes through the system, then it's at the adjudication stage because of the laws. There's implicit or explicit, however you want to look at it, racial bias embedded in the laws. And so it's a double whammy.
Yeah, I should mention, I don't know why I didn't, but Chris Young is featured in our documentary, The Vanishing Trial. Brittany's in there, his lawyer talking about the case, does an incredible job. And I know she's still fighting for him. I want to talk because a lot of the folks who follow us are family members who are dealing with loved ones inside. And there were some parts in the book that really struck me as an advocate, just how you can get worn out. There were times where you thought you had achieved a victory, and then, the client, it's stupid, I couldn't call it a client. I mean, these are like friends and, family of yours, are disappointed in the result. Or, you're taking a half measure, right? Like, I mean, even look at the Obama Clemency Initiative. It's like 1,700 people had their sentences commuted. 71% were Black, shaved thousands of years off sentences off people who didn't need them. And yet there was still a sense of, oh, it should have been more. And there were people like Alice Marie Johnson who were left behind. And then just even as an advocate, aside from your client's sort of feelings of being let down, just your own, it's an emotional investment you're making in this work. And you talk in the book about self-care, which is sort of this growing buzzword that we talk about at FAMM. But you talked about it a little differently, as opposed to just, hey, taking a break and eating some ice cream and treating yourself, to a different type of thing, which seems a little more about nourishing your spirit. And so can you talk about that and how you see self-care?
Yeah, I see self-care more of how it was formed in its radical roots, not how the term has been co-opted as a form of escapism. I see self-care is more of a time to replenish and to replenish so that you could do more transformative work in the community. And I see self-care as a radical act, an act that is not easy to practice, you know, even for me. As I talk about it and as I'm more conscious and aware of it, it's still not easy to remember the need for self-care.
What are the X's and O's of that? Like, I mean, take it from that abstract concept to what works for you to practice self-care.
What works for me is these reminders and community of people surrounding me to remind me that I cannot pour from an empty cup. And my co-counsel on many of my cases, my angel Cody, is also like a sister to me. And last year we did a 90 days of freedom where we worked to free 17 people, serving life. And every week we would meditate and we would have a theme we would meditate on. And every Sunday we would talk either through voice memo or FaceTime and cover issues that we were feeling, whether it was boundaries of saying no, I can't take another case right now, or boundaries of just resisting less, you know. But having an accountability partner was very and is very helpful for me, just to remind me and for me to remind her that we have to take care of ourselves first, you know. And so I started to meditate. Actually, Corey Jacobs taught me to meditate while he was in prison, you know, and really just trying to replenish in a way that I remember, okay, if I don't answer this Corling's email today, the world is not gonna end.
Yeah, yeah. And it's such a blessing and a curse, right? Like it's the part that just wears you out, but then it turns into the most gratifying thing.
It does. It does.
I'm so grateful at FAMM. I always say we're at the intersection of people and policy. Like, to do policy, I love, but to see how it impacts real people is what, you know, gives it so much more meaning. And but it can wear you down. And so I know as advocates we have to do that. And I know as family members who have loved ones in,
Mm-hmm.
they're worried all day. And so the question is, how do you compartmentalize or whatever it is to say, no, I struck a blow today. I called the prison and asked about their whereabouts. I called my congressman or congresswoman and said, you know, do this or that. But at some point I got to put down my advocacy and live my life. And I think those bounds are hard to draw for people.
It's a very thin line to walk, you know, and I can sympathize and empathize, you know, because when one person goes to prison, the whole family goes. And whether it was the forefront of my mind or subconsciously, you know, my mom in prison in that white uniform on that concrete bunk, you know, it never leaves.
Yeah. Well, I want to move as we get closer to the end, into a positive direction, because I think there's so much negativity just generally right now, not only like in the country, but in the movement about, yes, we want transformative change, but I'm sort of in your school of thought, which is we have a lane, we try to keep our head down and keep making progress in that lane, and we don't get everything, and then we come back and we just keep asking for more. And that's the best we can do, because, you know, if everybody did what we wanted, we could put ourselves out of business, but we're not there yet. But tell me about the fight for life sentences for people serving drugs. How's it going? How many are there left? You know, like, how's it looking?
We have been very fortunate and won every case that we've had, you know, and I want to celebrate that victory, because it's so easy to get lost in the accomplishments because there's so much more work still to do. And so we, combined with my co-counsel and I, have freed over 50 people, sentenced to die in prison for drugs, who survived over 1,000 years in prison. And so that is going really well. They're out, they're living their life after life, as we call it. And it's just beautiful to see that how their freedom is not only impacting them and their immediate family, but anyone that they positively impact in the future. You know, aside from that, there are hundreds of people still buried alive under these life sentences. there's a lot more work to do. We're doing a lot of litigation through the First Step Act right now, you know, which is a good initial first step. And what I don't feel people realize is the work that still has to come after the bills are passed, you know, and in every case that I've mentioned, we've probably represented, gosh, over 30 something First Step Act cases, and the government has opposed every single case, you know, and so it's a lot of work to be done still, you know, but we're definitely picking lots of human cages one by one. And hopefully there'll be some conversation soon for the second step or the third or the fourth, whatever we want to call it, to, as a starting point, make the provisions in the First Step Act that weren't retroactive, and really understand if these laws were wrong yesterday, they're wrong today, and be able to get even more people free. So we've made a lot of progress and got some amazing wins. And like I said, I want to celebrate us for that. And we know we have more work to do, and we're doing it.
Yeah, you got to spike the ball when you get a win, because sometimes it's few and far between. You got to.
Yeah, especially with the sentences, you know, and you forget sometimes, because when we were doing the 90 days of freedom, at first we were like, oh, we got such and such it's getting free today, immediate release. And we're like crying and joyous. And then we started to get numb to it because we had the next case to go to. And we're like, who did we get free last? You know, that's not cool, you know? And so we have to celebrate the wins.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, like, I think there's been progress too. And I think, you know, First Step is rightly seen as just a first step, but there's been changes to the federal drug guidelines. You had the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder. It took 8 years to make it retroactive, but that got done. We just had a meeting with Congressman Hakeem Jeffries about doing the rest of the provisions retroactive, trying to make that a priority.
Oh, that's great.
Early next year. But the Obama Clemency Initiative, which you were a big part of and which we helped out on, you know, it's not nothing when 1,700 people, including several hundred lifers, get their sentences commuted. I mean, that's not.
We have to feel that how these lives were saved, how families were reunited. And, you know, I had 7 clients who got clemency out of that, you know, and I'm just overjoyed for them. You know, I can't, in hindsight, everything's 2020, and there's definitely a lot of ways to be more efficient in clemency process and all of that. But it's a lot of beautiful people enjoying their freedom right now as we speak.
No, and that's the thing I can't say to people enough. I mean, you know, one of Obama clemency recipients, Norman Brown's on our board, and you gain so much by knowing people who were supposed to die in prison. And when I was looking at the numbers, and the original crack reform, the Fair Sentencing Act, and then the First Step Act's retroactivity, saved 38,000 total years from sentences that people were serving for crack cocaine. And so it's almost mind-boggling to think about that there would have been fellow citizens of ours who would have served an extra 38,000 years in prison. And now they're not going to spend it there, and we're not going to suffer any loss in public safety. You know, I mean, communities and families will be better off for it. And so in one ways, I think we do have to spike the ball and be grateful for that. But the other thing is, it should really encourage us to say to those who oppose these efforts, what were you thinking, right? Because they still don't think they did anything wrong. And yet, you know, almost 40,000 years of prison time that would have been a total waste. I mean, we're doing something wrong. And we should be humbled by that to realize there are other things we could do too. So let me ask you this. You're queen for the day. What are you passing? What's the reform, one or two reforms you're doing that takes us to the next step? I mean, retroactivity, clearly.
Yeah, retroactivity, clearly, you know, normalizing the clemency process.
Yeah.
Definitely, you know, and really just, for me, I'm just thinking of visually, you know, and trying to be a visionary about it. How can we completely reimagine and transform this system? As you mentioned, like, do we really want a system where Alice Johnson is dying in prison? Do we really want a system where the Corey Jacobs and the Norman Browns and Sharonda Joneses are dying in prison? You know, and so for me, it would just be to get everyone to wake up if I was queen with my wand, you know, and then that would get so many more. We would be talking much more greater than retroactivity, you know, and it's just that getting people there, you know, this system is ill in its design.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's doing more harm than good to a lot of people. And I'm not just saying this from 50,000 feet in the air. I've been there.
Yeah, I think Sharonda's, I think of Sharonda as I do about Norman, which is to meet somebody like that and to think that our system, you know, was trying to force them to die in prison is such an indictment. I mean, and people say, well, it's one person. Well, now we know that's not true because there's been hundreds of lifers freed. And we're no worse off for it. We're better off for it. I mean, I haven't seen the recidivism numbers of the Obama C. Clemency Project, but I know they're low. And
Yeah, no, they are too. Of our 53, we've had 0.
and these are supposed to be the worst of the worst, right? I mean, that's the thing.
They don't know, and that's what, thinking of the point of rehabilitation in prison. You know, it doesn't. My mom served 2.5 years. She's doing amazing. That was even too long for her, you know, because she had a drug addiction. My mom got sober in spite of prison, not because of it. Yeah. And looking at her 2.5 years and how that seemed like forever for us, and thinking of Sharonda's daughter and that 16 years and 9 months, or a client I'm working on now who's been in for 27 years. Come on, like it's mind-boggling that people can't see what's wrong, whether they're looking at it from a moral aspect or an economic aspect. This is not a system that we should be proud of.
Well, I'm actually something very specific, because Sandy Saldonado, who's I know somebody who is watching, her husband got first step retroactivity, and now the government's appealing to send him back. He and his co-defendants. I mean, they keep losing these cases. So I just was going to ask you, is that your experience? I mean, you must have fought these cases. You're doing the crack retro. I mean, what is the government doing trying to send people back? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I don't understand it. It's mind-boggling to me, especially once a federal judge has already decided.
Yeah.
You know, it makes no sense. To me, it's an utter waste of resources and human life. You know, I just feel like there should be much more important things for the government to be fighting. I don't understand the vindictiveness of it. And I'm not sure the circumstances of her case, but the cases I've seen, we're not talking about people that just went to prison yesterday.
I know.
They served 20 years, 20 plus years already. I don't, and had remarkable, tremendous rehabilitative efforts, you know, and I don't understand it at all. But I'm of the breed that I don't care how many infractions you got for hooch or whatever. I would probably be drinking alcohol in prison too if I had life. You don't deserve to die in prison. And we have to get these labels off. And I don't understand what the prosecution is doing. I don't understand why we're getting opposed on every single case. I don't get it.
Yeah, they came to celebrate the First Step Act passage last December with us, and we were going and meeting members of Congress and thanking them. And the government called while they were visiting us in Washington and said, we're appealing the release. So now they've been out about a year trying to get on with their lives, but has this cloud hanging over them. So it does feel just cruel and senseless, and just such a waste of resources.
It is a waste of resources, and it's a form of mental violence.
Yeah.
It is. It's sickening. It's disgusting to me.
Yeah. Well, we're just at the end. So I'm going to tell everybody again, I'm a nonprofit. I'm not forcing anybody to do anything, but I just want to say her book is A Knock at Midnight. It is a great read. And like I said, there's a lot of great books on criminal justice that really get into policy, and you'll learn from this book. But the stories are what make it. I didn't tell the stories. I want to give them away, but they really, they sort of carry the book, and Brittany's work on behalf of a number of these. You're also going to hear about some stars. She's now friends with Kim Kardashian and P. Diddy. So she's really reached the top here. But it's at the end of the day, I so appreciate your commitment to just, like you said, picking locks one by one. And I think it's a testament to the fact that, you know, individuals can make a difference. That one person just putting their time and talent to something can help people. And so, you know, thank you for the work that you do. And I just want to, at the end, we always say, you know, any parting thoughts you want to share or close, you know, we appreciate.
No, just thank FAMM for all the work that you do and have been doing, and for having me on today, and just for everyone just to not give up hope. The dawn will come, and just remember, there's nothing more urgent than freedom.
That's well said. All right. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week for another Heart to Heart series show. Thanks.
Bye, y'all.